how we escaped.
You're welcome to use whatever language you would like, and feel free to just be yourself.
Okay, that's great to know. Thanks,
But you don't have
Gerette.
to. You don't have to swear. I'm just saying you can
Yeah.
if you want. I won't be disappointed if you don't.
Okay.
All right.
And you won't judge me if I do.
No, I will not. This is a judgment-free zone.
Okay, sounds great. We're on the same page. I love it.
All right. I am going to count us in. Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
This is the How We Escaped podcast. And now, here's your host, Rob Drake.
Greetings, fellow sojourners. Welcome to the How We Escaped podcast, where we explore the stories of people who broke free from the impossible and embraced the unknown. Escape isn't just about running away. It's about courage, survival, and the human yearning to live free and to flourish. The views and opinions shared by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast or its humble host, me, Rob Drake. This podcast touches on themes of abuse, control, narcissism, and includes strong language. Listener discretion is advised. As always, let's get to today's story as quickly as possible. Our guest today is Gerette Buglion. She is the author of the book An Everyday Cult. The book tells Gerette's incredible story of her search for meaning as she spent 18 years in a manipulative, controlling group run by a man who claimed he could see into her soul. I found it especially interesting that some of my preconceived notions about cults did not apply to this group. Her book is called An Everyday Cult, and it's a fascinating read. You don't want to miss it. You can order it from Amazon in paperback or listen to it on Audible. And the audiobook is narrated by Gerette. I always love that when authors narrate their own books. Gerette wants to live in a world where cult leaders, narcissistic abusers, and unethical manipulative marketing techniques are spotted, called out, and silenced, creating more opportunities for nourishing relationships to flourish. Her work as educator and consultant centers on liberation from coercive control and supporting the integrative power of writing for survivors of cultic relationships through Writing to Reckon programs. Gerette also facilitates the biannual Writing Symposium for Survivors, Reclaiming Autonomy Through the Written Word, and is co-founder and executive director for the nonprofit Living Cult Free. She has also authored Writing to Reckon Journal for survivors of spiritual, religious, and cultic abuse. Gerette, you are on the air. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a delight and an honor to be here, Rob. I appreciate your introduction and the use of the word sojourner. It's a word I haven't heard in a long time, and it's a beautiful word, and it is a great orientation to the conversation today that I'm very much looking forward to.
Well, thank you, Gerette. I wanted to start by asking you about a very poignant chapter in your book, and it takes us back to the month of January in 2014. Your brother Raymond tragically and unexpectedly passed away after falling and hitting his head. And his girlfriend set a date for the funeral, but you had a conflict that day because this group that we are about to talk about, they were holding their annual winter retreat. And even though it came through in your book so clearly how much you loved your brother, you were torn about where you should go. Tell us about the choice you made and why you made it.
Big deep breath here. That is and continues to be one of the hardest decisions that I made while I was in the grip of the cultic narrative. I decided to not go to my brother's funeral because I believed that it was more important for me to be with what at the time I thought was my true family. So my sisters were out there, my father was out there. My mother couldn't be there because she had literally just been operated on. She had had a double knee replacement the day that my brother died. And so I concocted a narrative that actually had something to do with, since mom can't be there, we will find something somehow to honor Raymond's death. And therefore I can get both. I can be with my true family at the winter retreat. One of the hardest aspects of what transpired based on that decision that I made, and what I will say, I now understand that decision was made from a place of being under the influence of being indoctrinated into a mindset where my mind was not fully my own. My capacity for discernment had been hijacked, and hijacked by my ex-teacher and the group that I was a part of. But at the time, I really thought that I was making a decision that was in my best interest. And instead, it's a decision that tragically still has ripples in my family life today, because my choice to not go to our brother's funeral meant that I was not present for a series of events that were extremely difficult for my sisters. And a rift occurred between my sisters and I. That although I've tried to resolve that over the years, and it's now 12 years since Raymond's death, there is still tension and estrangement. So the implications of that have been long lasting and pretty devastating, actually.
The reason why I started with this question was because I think that this story shows us how wrapped up you were in this group and how much control they had. And when I read that chapter, it was heartbreaking for your family, of course, but also for you, because it did seem to me that you were acting out of your best intentions, and you were doing at the time what you thought was best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally thought that it was what's best for me, because obviously the sudden death of my brother was devastating. I mean, it had a huge impact on my life. And at the time, for me, processing large emotions or any kind of conflict or complexity, I truly believed that I needed my teacher and I needed my community in order to really be truthful to myself, and in order to be in step, in integrity with my relationship to the divine. What, of course, I didn't know was that relationship was, had been, as I used the word hijacked a minute ago, that it had been crafted by my ex-teacher, and the group as a whole. A moment in my life that I still go back to, especially right now. Here we are, recording just a few weeks past the anniversary of his death. So at the anniversaries, there's so much that comes up. And I've recently spent quite a bit of time, with my sisters, because there have been a couple of other elders in our family who have died. So I've been at 2 different funerals. And so there's like that wound just gets touched again and again and again.
Well, let's go back to your early life, to your childhood. Tell us about your family and
Hmm.
where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in rural New York State, and I grew up on a dairy farm. I was actually born down closer to New York City, but only on Long Island, but only lived there till I was 6. But life for me really started once we moved to the country because that's where I loved being outdoors. I've always had a strong connection to the outdoors. And for me, that's like where life began. So living upstate and then once we started dairy farming, I was in heaven, having a strong relationship with the animals. I'm one of 7 children. So I have 3 siblings who are older than me and 3 younger. I'm middle child of 7. So we were a big farm family living in the country, a really beautiful, life in many ways. My parents were idealists, moving from Long Island to the country was this like kind of radical thing. My father, who was a technical writer and had an engineering degree in mind, he kind of gave it all up for this idea of what it would be to farm. And we did that for, most of my child, from age 5 or 6 until I was 16 when my parents divorced and we lost the farm. We lost the farm first. The farm went bankrupt. My parents divorced. And then that was a massive transition and rupture, of course, in my life. And then I moved to another part of the state, 5 hours away. So at 16, there was like a whole nother life stage that happened for me in a different part of New York State.
With the turbulence that you experienced, you mentioned losing the farm and the divorce. Do you think any of those things made you more vulnerable to getting sucked into a group like this later on?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, Rob. And yes, in my mind, there is a real relationship between this attachment that I was seeking with my ex-teacher, who I call Doug, and the pain and the rupture that occurred in my family. Interestingly, when we went bankrupt and my parents divorced, I chose to move with my father and just one of my sisters. And my other 3 younger sisters stayed with our mom. And my brother and my older sister were already moving, out of the house. Although I loved my father a lot, there were really challenging aspects of what it was to live with him. He had a drinking problem, which I didn't know about, and I'm not really sure that he had a drinking problem before we moved. I don't think he did, but it definitely developed once we were in our new place. So yeah, I definitely had father issues, and seeking the attachment of my ex-teacher, I think, was absolutely really had a through line to my attachment, this seeking. And I guess I would also say, Rob, that there was that sense of idealism that not all of my family experienced, but definitely my father and I both had a kind of idealism that had us seeking in different directions. So I think that's also a contributing factor.
Were you religious growing up? Did you go to church?
We were very bad churchgoers on the farm because why I say bad is that we would only show up like Christmas and Easter. But I was raised Catholic. I did attend Catholic school for the early part of my schooling. I also have memories of enjoying being in church, enjoying sitting next to my mother when she was singing a hymn, because her voice would sometimes kind of soar above the others. So we were not religious, we were not overtly religious, but we had that orientation.
I really loved your book for many different reasons. It was very well written and engaging. I appreciated how you divide the book up into sections. So you have chapters, but you also have these sections which take us through the phases of your involvement with this group. And I just want to read them here for our listeners because we'll be going through each one of them. The phases are falling, drifting, asleep, snapping, and then waking up again and again. And I love those because they really were apt descriptions of what you went through during these 18 years. And I want to start with the falling phase. Tell us about the first time that you met Doug, who was the leader of this group. And just so our listeners know, there are some names and places that have been changed in this book. So we're not talking about someone with the real name of Doug, but that's the name that you gave him. And Doug was running this center, which you've also given another name, the Center for Transformational Learning. So what was it like the first time you met Doug?
Oh my gosh, I was totally jittery with excitement to meet Doug, because there had been a lot of anticipation. I had several friends who I worked with in a Waldorf school who had been working with him, and they were so excited. But I had delayed my getting to meet him because I was pregnant, and I wanted to wait until after my daughter was at least 6 months old before I started something new. So, like right when she was 6 months old, I had scheduled my first session with Doug. My husband had started just a couple weeks before me. And in the first session, I came into I came into that with just this burning quest to find out once and for all if he could help me to determine whether I had been sexually abused as a child. It was this, I had had a very nagging sense of that throughout my early adulthood. And I was 33 years old, well, 34, I guess, when I first started seeing Doug. And I really believed that he could help me. And in that very first session, I blurted that out to him with this, like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm telling this man who I've never met, but I feel like I know him already because my friends I've talked about him all the time, and I know I can trust him. And so, like, I already had all these preconceived ideas about who he was and how much he could help me. And I blurted out that really deeply personal information in my first session. And then I also shared that, like, the work that Doug helped people with was dream work. So he was a dream analyst. He never liked the word analyst, but that's what he was. And the dream that I shared included a friend of mine who I was worried about, that she was being abused by her new husband. But that was what happened in real life, that she did have a new husband. And by the way, she also and he were dairy farmers. So I had a really strong kind of connection with her just because of my childhood experience of being a dairy farmer, which was an important part of my identity. And in the dream, I'm worried that she was being abused by him. And the way that Doug analyzed that dream, he really dismissed that part of it and pointed out that there's no evidence that she was being abused. So, don't worry about it. Let's focus on these other aspects of the dream. And he gives this like homework after each session where he kind of sums up, here's what you can focus on for the next, until I see you next time. And like the homework is something that you're supposed to remember to go back to again and again throughout your days. And, his homework was something completely unrelated to that part of the dream that I was concerned about. And I left that session with this kind of the last words that he said to me, like ringing in my ears and in my heart, which was something like, I heard what you said about your concerns about sexual abuse, and let's put it to the side for now. If it really was an issue, your dreams will show you. And, on some level, I think that actually was good advice, because to obsess about something is not necessarily a healthy thing. But it absolutely made me riveted and excited to be working with him, because I felt really seen. I felt his acknowledgement and really appreciated that. And because my friends were so excited about him, I ignored the parts that felt incongruous or the parts that were unsettling. And there were various aspects of that. For example, it was like, I don't know, another 6 months or so, maybe longer, before he knew that I was a dairy farmer and that was an important part of my identity. He didn't ask about that aspect of my dream. He also didn't ask about the aspect of the fact that the reason I was concerned about my friend being abused is that I believed that her husband had hurt the cows in the dream. And that is something like a direct parallel with my father, because in my childhood, when things got really rough before the divorce and the bankruptcy, he really started losing it, and he would beat the cows. Like, I witnessed my father beat the cows. And it was a devastating part of my experience for me because of my deep attachment to the animals. And Doug completely, missed that there was anything in that area. And I found out, maybe 6 months or a year later, that indeed my friend was being abused. And fortunately, she did get out of the marriage. So my dream contained something of my deep intuitive knowing that was completely disregarded. So all of those things were unseen, unrecognized. They were all opportunities that could have connected me more deeply to who I am. And instead, the sum total of that first session, which the pattern continued then for 18 years of, I believed that Doug had a way of looking at things that would be helpful for me, because the homework that he gave me was to actually trust the farmer, trust the man, her husband, who I thought was abusing her, and open up to new possibility, because he believed that that man was the animus. And in dream work, the animus is the spiritual male. Right from that first session, of course, my hindsight is 2020, but dependency was anchored in, as well as a taking away of my autonomy, a taking away of my true self.
Why do you think that Doug ignored this part of your dream and really refused to address it? Was this intentional?
That's the $1,000,000 cult leader question that you just asked, Rob. I believe it's a bit mixed. In my situation, there are many ways that I would consider, Doug like a bad cult leader. There are some ways that Doug could have been more controlling and more manipulative, and he wasn't. And I say that now understanding the broader, the very wide spectrum of cultic abuses that people experience, because that's like the work that I do today. So I've, over the last 12 years, I've experienced that very wide spectrum from, the very serious, nefarious, profound, physical, sexual, macabre kind of abuse to a long spectrum of manipulation. And I would say Doug was somewhere, definitely not towards the worst of the worst. So with Doug, I honestly think that he believed his shtick. So he believed that he had insight. And he was so blindsided by the animus is the be all and the end all. And he was so disassociated from the feminine that he could only see what he could see. And he couldn't be there for women. And ironically, most of his clients were women. A large, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of his clients were women. But nonetheless, his work and work with dreams was intriguing to us.
The work with dreams was very intriguing to me because I think about myself. I rarely dream. And when I do dream, I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be aware that I had a dream, but usually it's gone. I can't remember what it was. In your book, you write down some pretty vivid dreams in detail. Do you feel like you dreamed more than the average person? And was this the case for everyone in this group?
I think it's kind of widely, kind of in the scientific world, understood that we do all dream. And the issue is what that moment that you referred to of when you wake up, you can learn how to remember your dreams. And it's creating that space that turns you into someone who, might be considered more of a dreamer. But really, anyone and everyone dreams, every time you go into, REM sleep. It's interesting too, because when I left the dream work, I stopped dreaming. I stopped remembering my dreams. I had, maybe 3 dreams in the whole first year that I remembered. And it was, I think it was more about, okay, I'm done, give me a break. And I was really, really appreciative that I was not actively recalling them. And ironically, Rob, I've just recently started recalling my dreams more. Here I am 12 years later, and I've had some pretty strong dreams that I'm remembering. So, and I'm actually, writing about them, which is an interesting process.
This term that you use to describe Doug, dream analyst, I had never heard of this term before. Is this a thing? Are there other people who say that they're dream analysts? And is there any sort of qualification or education that one needs to be a dream analyst?
Yeah, I love that question. Yes, there are many dream analysts. The work of Carl Jung is, where many people get their foothold in dream analysis. And that's where Doug started as well, but he definitely branched off from there into combining other things with it. And some people incorporate working with dreams. Some people who are therapists, who are licensed clinical mental health therapists, might do extra training focused on dreams. And I'm quite sure, I don't quote me on this, but I believe there are some certifications, like you can get continuing education credits as a therapist that include dream analysis. Doug had nothing. Doug was literally, like a postal worker, a civil servant, and he was completely self-taught. He had zero credentials. It's definitely, a red flag for me today when I'm working with clients or talking to people about how they might avoid getting involved in situations like this. It is way less likely to happen if someone has training and credentials, but it still can happen. I mean, there are licensed therapists who are also cultic leaders, so it's not 100%.
It seemed like his behavior was unprofessional from the beginning, because you talk about how open he was with others about your story or about your dreams. And I assumed that went the other way. And these dreams, of course, revealed very intimate, sensitive information. How did he get away with that?
How he got away with it is that he created a culture in which that was acceptable. So, to kind of refer back to the different stages I experienced. The first stage is this like falling in love. We talk about love bombing. Like, there was a lot of things that felt good. Even though there were some hard things in that first session, I also left with this elated sense. And that continued for, oh gosh, I'd say the first almost 5 years. Like, there was a feeling of learning new things, lifting the veil, peeling back the curtain into the unconscious. And it was very exciting. And I was learning so much about myself. There was like the promise that if you really focus on your dreams, you too can become, like a woman of God. Like, that's the promise. And what you were just asking about, like, how does he get away with this? How did he get away with this unethical sharing of information? Is that it's more in what I call the drifting stage, which is there's this culture where things that are unethical are normalized, and they don't look unethical. It looked like, oh, open communication, and it looked like transparency because of the way that he couched it. But when you take that, that stepped back look, it is glaringly unethical to take the private information that one client shares with you, an individual session, and to reveal that content to other people, broadcast it at times, and to share information from other people's sessions. It is just so egregious from any like really basic standards of how you behave with other people's private information. Like, even in the business world, you don't do that, or even in education, like there's rules and there's moral conduct, and that all gets kind of questioned and eroded in this kind of drifting away, this unmooring. Like, I was a teacher for 18 years, and there were intrinsic ethics, but I was gradually slipping away from my values. Year after year, there's like a slow erosion, an erosion of my values, of what makes me who I am today.
I was really curious to know about the financial aspect of this group. Did you pay every time you had a session or had any contact with Doug and this group?
You betcha. You pay every session is individual. As the Center for Transformational Learning, as I call it, got more and more developed throughout my 18 years of involvement. And there were actually rules. You had to see Doug or one of the other head therapists, at minimum 2 times a month. I also developed an incredible dependence on Doug for our marriage counseling. So my husband and I saw Doug for couples work every month for years and years, because again, that same dependency was developed. And I also purchased a business at Doug's endorsement and encouragement, a business that I literally had no business purchasing because I knew nothing about how to run. I purchased a cleaning company, and I had never had any experience with anything like this. So he was seeing that I was struggling financially and really encouraged me to purchase this. He also knew that my husband, Frank, had received some inheritance money. So he, strongly encouraged me to purchase this cleaning company and invest, agree to pay $100,000 for something, which I did. Like, I signed a contract. We gave away a large chunk of the inheritance that my husband had received, and the constant paying out was just never ending, because not only was it the individual sessions, I also, like I mentioned, I purchased a business at Doug's suggestion. I also had to have individual session, or not individual sessions, but I had sessions with Doug and my office manager, who was also seeing Doug. He had encouraged me to hire another one of his clients to be my office manager, who had zero skills necessary. And I was paying her 3 times what I was getting myself, because I was told, I was indoctrinated to believe that the goods were going to come in the long run. And before long, there was going to be so much money that, we would all be elevated. And what ended up happening instead is I ended up needing to file bankruptcy. I mean, it was a house of cards. It was a total shit show, and it collapsed.
And this is where I felt like this group did look a lot different than other cults, because another leader might have said, give me the $100,000, donate it. But in this case, he was telling you to buy this business. Again, I have to ask, do you think he had some ulterior motive?
I think he really believed that there was the potential for this business, for me to make good money. And if I'm making good money, there's more money in his pocket. He supported this kind of entrepreneurial idea. And there were several other people who were part of the inner circle in the organization who had flourishing businesses. And I think he pictured that this would be another one. And ironically, I've never thought about this, Rob, but I would be so curious to know what he thinks today if he reflects back on that advice giving that he gave. Because ironically, several of those people who actually had flourishing businesses, several of them tanked under his guidance. There were, oh gosh, at one point I counted them up. I think there were almost a dozen people in this small group. I mean, this group was only a few hundred people who were part of it, who he encouraged to file bankruptcy.
he shouldn't have been giving business advice. But then again, you have to look back and go, but all these people going into bankruptcy on his advice, was this intentional, that it was to his advantage to have these people go bankrupt and then perhaps be dependent on him even more?
Mm. Oh, good question, Rob. I honestly never thought about it in quite that light. A pattern that happened with at least several of the bankruptcies was going into debt to pay for sessions. So, yeah, there's this way that the dependency is intensified because, see, you're a loser. Like there was this moment. It's such an interesting question, Rob. I thank you for this because there was a moment when I was really, really striving. I worked my ass off in that business. Like I was working, 80 hours a week to make this thing go. I had young children. I was abandoning my children at home for this business because I believed through Doug's coaching that God had blessed this business and that the fruits would be revealed at some point. So I was really working, but there was a point that the narrative shifted and it was devastating for me. And the narrative became, Gerette, you're never going to make it. You're a loser. Forget it. The animus has left your business. It's not worth it. And in a certain way that made me dig deeper because I had invested so much, like to lose all of that, to lose the years of working so hard on it. It was devastating, and it made me. I literally went through a period where I believed I needed Doug even more, and I was doing like daily sessions with him at this point to try to finally break through, like break that resistant spirit of mine, so that I could finally have a direct connection to the divine. In any cultic group, and in mine as well, you have to have a problem, in a personal problem. In religious groups, there's the sinning, so like the sinning version of me personally was that I was incredibly arrogant and my arrogance was blinding me. And that had to be broken. And in order to break it, we had to go through, more and more and more exorcisms in a way, not literal, but the dreams were like a kind of exorcism of that dark side of myself. So when you start to fail, there's more darkness that gets revealed. So I'm talking about how he might be looking at the psyche of person, that more and more darkness gets revealed and that it's his job to come in with his sharp scalpel of being able to see and knowing each individual so well. Like I truly believed that he knew me better than I knew myself. There was no question in my mind that his insight is what was going to help me, to finally rid myself of that evil, that darkness within me. So yeah, it creates more darkness. You fail financially, you're a loser, you're uncovering more and more parts of self. Hey, thank you for that, Rob. That really resonates, that was actually part of his nefarious plan, conscious or not.
Well, and you talked about this word pathology, which this really fascinated me because I think we all know what pathology means in the real world. But tell us about what this word meant in your group and how it was used against you or to control you.
Yeah, pathology is exactly that. It's the dark side of the self that was very difficult. It was the way that it was taught is that in the dreams, every dream would actually reveal both the what we call the process, like where a person could move towards the divine, but it would also always reveal the pathology. And that was the part of you that was rebelling against God, or rebelling against whatever the animus wanted to teach you at any particular moment. And we had to, unearth and recognize and face into this pathology in order for it to be lessened and to be reduced in our daily life. So yeah, it was the dark side. It was the self that could not be trusted, the self that actually needed to be healed and was resistant to healing. Resistance was a huge word, just almost as big as pathology was used, because if you're resisting learning what will help you to open up to the divine, that resistance becomes, the biggest barrier to self, to personal growth, to spiritual fulfillment.
These terms that you're using, like animus and pathology, and a few others in your book as well, sound very religious. Was Doug starting his own religion?
It's a great question, and it certainly has all the trappings of what a religion needs. There was a doctrine, there was a community, there was a kind of, when I talk about this, I'm talking about more of like a controlling type of religion. There are so many parallels. There's almost, I like to think of it as the cult leader's handbook. Like, it really feels that there's a given number of factors that are necessary to create an isolated and insular controlling, religion or tribe or, community, whatever words you want to use. And they are universal. You can see it in, an ashram setting, the very same tenets. You can see it even in business settings, in multi-level marketing settings. There's like this tribe kind of mentality where there's specific language that's used, and you connect to this specific kind of language. There's, the social proof of, you get a certain number of people who are believing it. You're more likely to believe it when you come in. There's really well-developed narrative that ironically also has to include some amount of what I call, and what others also call, word salad. Have you heard that? Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
Word salad? Yeah. There's a bit of talking in circles, but everyone is nodding along saying, yeah, that sounds right. And we're nodding along saying that sounds right because there was stuff before that we were told that was true and meaningful and resonant. And we were nodding our heads and saying, yes, that sounds right, because it was then. But then you get to a point where circular thinking, this word salady, gobbledygook, also holds you in because you think that there's deep, profound meaning in there. And if you just look harder, you're going to find it.
That's very profound. What we're talking about here is mind control and groupthink. I mean, you look around the room and everybody else is nodding their head, and you're thinking, well, I don't get it, but it's my fault that I don't get it, right? Because it looks like everybody else gets it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this was another theme in your book, which I found very interesting, was you wanting to belong to the group, because the people that you knew from that group seemed to be happy and fulfilled. Would you say that he preyed on this want of yours?
Absolutely. And I would say even more so, he preyed on the natural human need to belong. Like we human beings, like we are wired for connection. We can't exist in isolation. We go, we become insane if we are completely isolated. Co-regulation is a natural part of the human experience where we get to learn from each other. And once there's enough of a mass of people who are believing, who are bought in, it attracts more and more people. Like it becomes kind of a magnet. And yeah, and that it is just this, this human need. It's so deep. It's primal.
I want to get back to the phases. So we've talked about falling, and maybe we're in the drifting phase by now. I'm not sure, but just a question about drifting.
Yeah.
Was there a point during the drifting phase when you still had a chance to get out of this thing, where you were still aware enough that maybe there's some things about this that aren't right and I need to leave?
Yeah, I love that question. I think absolutely. During the drifting stage, I had, as a family, we moved away from, where this Center for Transformational Learning was flourishing to pursue something that was kind of a long time dream of my husband and I, for our family. So we relocated our family to live in an intentional community, but we stayed connected to doing the dream work. So we just shifted to having phone sessions instead of, being in person. And at that point, ironically, there were some cultic elements in the intentional community that we moved to, but, not nefariously. And I also, I thought part of why I wanted to live in that area was that several of my sisters and my mother lived in that area. So I also thought, oh, this is a great opportunity where we can connect with our family more. Unfortunately, the life in the intentional community was so demanding that there really wasn't a lot of opportunity to connect with my family members as I had hoped. And I guess, I'd like to think that if my good friends and my family knew what was going on in my psyche at that time, and they had been, I hid it because, of course, I'm living in this other place, but my mind, a large percentage of my mind in this drifting stage believed that, believed that this work, that I was down there so that I could actually bring the work to this new location. And that didn't really happen as I had hoped. It just didn't, there was no support for it to happen. The organization wasn't big enough to actually have me, have my husband and I be like a missionary kind of thing. But maybe if it had been a little bit more blatant and I had been more transparent, perhaps those relationships with my siblings and with my mother could have deepened at that point. Instead, I had this experience of, oh, I'm living here and there are parts of this life that I like, but parts of it that I really don't like. My husband and I went through a really hard period there. And I, after a year of being there, we had just made our commitment to spending in second year. I had kind of a breaking point for myself that I really wanted to just get back home. So it's like I was fracturing. My values were spread thin. I was parenting. I was in this one, I was physically in one place, but I was emotionally and psychologically tethered to this weird thing with my dreams that was actually dominating my psyche. Had I the wherewithal to have had really good therapy at that time, believe me, there would have been questions about priority, like what was important to me. I mean, I would like to think that a good therapist would have caught that split.
When I got to the part in your book about you and your husband moving away, I think it was in 2003, you rented out your house. I was excited. I thought, okay, this is the beginning of the end for her in this group. But I was also surprised by how it seemed like Doug wasn't resistant to this idea. And again, this is where I say this group is different than other cults I'm familiar with, because in other groups, the cult leader would go ballistic. What? You're moving away? You can't move away. I hoped as I was reading this in your book that maybe this was going to be the beginning of disconnection, but it's almost as if Doug knew that even though you were moving away, you were still tied to him and tied to this group, and you were going to come back one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting aspect of my experience where, I totally agree with you that so many other leaders there would be so much more resistance. And this is really the everyday cult aspect of what my particular experience was, because there was part of the narrative included this idea of openness, this idea that we are all free to come and go as we want. So it was like Doug would actually talk about the revolving door. You can go anytime and come back anytime. And that attitude was actually part of his hook, because it looked like freedom, but underneath it was this psychological dependence. And I believe you're right that he knew when he had someone hooked. And I was hooked, there's no question. My husband was a little less tethered to Doug than I was. In fact, my husband wanted to stay in that intentional community. But I went through a big experience that, people can read about in my book, that really made me it opened up this deep longing to return. And it was, what I now know is there were two aspects to that longing to return. One was the nefarious pull of Doug and the group, because the group was actually getting bigger and more exciting and more established. The classes, more and more classes were being taught, and the retreats were really intensifying. Like there was so much more than the individual sessions, so much more to pay for as well, of course. But the other part of that longing to return is an authentic relationship that I have with this place. I am sitting in my home now, the very home that I had rented out for those 2 years. And here we are, like it is so much my anchor. This land, the trees, I look outside to this massive white pine tree, like that was calling me back for like an anchor into myself. And my husband, we're very happy. My husband and I are together still. Unbelievably, we made it through that, but that's a longer story. And like this is our home. It's the place where our children call home. But because the group was calling me too, I believed that it was all about the group. And Doug really used that. That became a big, like the hook was in me. You can't see me, but I'm kind of reeling my hands, like, casting a line and reeling it in. At that point, I was coming back and I was hooked on Doug and hooked on the group.
How we escaped.
Hi, Rob Drake here. Do you have a story of escape to share with us on the How We Escaped podcast? We'd love to hear your story and to consider airing it on our show. You can contact us right now by heading over to howweescaped.com and filling out our contact form. That's howweescaped.com. You can also reach out to us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram.
You're listening to the How We Escaped podcast with Rob Drake.
And is this when you fall asleep?
Yes. That was the beginning of the falling asleep process, where I had put so much in. It's kind of that sunken cost idea. Like I had invested so much. It had to work. It absolutely had to work. And this is where, my psyche went through, really lost that in access to myself and my discernment in a very real way, in a very profound way. And that's when I experienced, it was after that point that both the bankruptcy happened, but there was also a really profound intervention that was used for me that involved strangling. Was deep, deep emotional abuse. And of course, this is a period that's the hardest part for me to reckon with as a mother, because, of course, I still have my children, but I was, present for them on one level, but mostly not present. Their needs were met. And, my husband and I were good co-parents, because he was a little less bought in to the work than I was. He took up a lot of the parenting slack during that period in particular. It was it was the most devastating period. That's also when my brother died, and I made that decision to not attend his funeral.
Was this group adults only, or was there something for children?
It was really for adults, but my daughter was peripherally involved, actually, and she even came to one retreat. She was a teenager, and I thought that was a really very exciting, beautiful thing. But fortunately for her, when she came to the retreat, she did not like it. So she did not pursue it anymore. But definitely, like probably, I think she was 16 or 17, but definitely not for anybody younger than that.
So when you come back in 2005, you are not just a client anymore. You are actively helping to build this center up.
Absolutely. Yes, I was very committed. It was like, yes, I had, the cleaning company that I purchased, but I also, it was like another job for me, was my volunteerism to promote this work and bring it into the world. It was a huge part of my life.
And I know that there were others with you who were helping in this endeavor. Did anyone ever question Doug? Or what would happen if someone did?
Yeah, a few people did question him. My husband was one. And when my husband would question him, he was given a really demeaning name. He was called Patho Trickster. and labeled as someone who could not be trusted. And then that became part of the spun narrative. And it also became, of course, tension in our marriage. Other people that questioned him were silenced. You know, there's a really interesting phenomenon that occurs as you get deeper and deeper and more committed to an organization. And that's what I call the hidden hierarchy. And there's always a hierarchy, and you can think you know what that hierarchy is, but there's often hidden elements to it. And I was completely unaware of the layers of hierarchy that I was under, because when I came back and committed more and more fully to the work, I joined what was called the executive committee, which I was told and I believed it was the decision-making body of the organization. But it wasn't until I left, when I snapped out, that I came to realize that there were like 4 layers above that, with Doug being the decision maker. So yeah, gosh, I lost the thread of the question that you asked.
No, I was just talking about Doug's reaction to people disagreeing with him.
Right, who questioned. So thanks for reminding me, because that's where I was going, that you wouldn't, people that questioned Doug, all of those questions would be handled on the higher levels in the hierarchy. So it would all be hidden from you. So only the most committed people would be privy to information of complaints. Like, there were multiple complaints that were made. But I, even though I was on the executive committee, had no clue that they were happening, because it was all being handled on those higher levels. And that's part of that, how silence and secrecy become a really important part of the controlling mechanism.
When I read your book, I see you as a person who is very committed to this group. But you're telling me that there were people above you who were even more committed, or at least Doug saw them as more committed. Was this a source of envy for you? Were you always thinking about wanting to move higher up?
Absolutely. You know, in all of my 18 years, I never became a teacher. A teacher was someone who, I'm using quotes here, was someone who at the dream work retreats would actually facilitate in small groups the facilitation of people's dreams. And we would do acting out, psychodynamic kind of acting out of the dreams. That was, the real draw of the retreats. And I always wanted to be a teacher. You know, one of the nefarious ways that the organization worked is that here we had this school, you would do all these classes, and there would always be more and more classes. And we even got to the point of being able, believe it or not, to, at the very end, we got certified to be those continuing education credits that a therapist could actually get, which was a scary idea. But there was always more and more to do, but there was no graduating. One person, so for example, there were several people that came into the group like 10, 15 years, later than I did. And they were just like, oh, move right up the hierarchy and become a teacher. And it was always based on their inner work. And who was the judge of their inner work? Well, it was Doug, ultimately. So he was the one that decided who was ready. And I think he also is the one who knew instinctively who were the loyal ones who would just stay and keep working harder. And I was one of those. There was kind of a small group of us who were these, dedicated worker bees. And I now have come to, after leaving the group, I learned that what was happening was that those places that I was longing to be, those teachers were starting to push back. And it had been going on for a while. And they're pushing back and saying, and no longer being willing to be the volunteer worker bees because they wouldn't even get paid. Like, I didn't even know what the financial structure was, but, we would pay thousands of dollars for these retreats, and it would all go into Doug's pocket. For the longest time, the teachers who were working really hard didn't get paid. They started pushing, and then eventually they did get paid a little bit. But all of that was hidden from me. I had no idea that it was going on. And that's what created the ultimate rift in the organization. All those teachers left at the same time.
Yes, well, I want to get to the snapping phase. I haven't been ignoring your husband on purpose. I was just waiting for the right time to just bring him in, because from what I remember reading from your book, he was the first one to join this group before you did. And then he was the first one to leave. Was his experience different than yours?
It absolutely was different. And part of what happened for him is, he was always just a little more, he had a few more skepticism genes than I did. He was not quite, loyalty was huge in me. And he was, a little more skeptical, which is a really good thing. I always want to encourage people to honor their whenever skepticism comes up. That's a healthy thing. So he had that going for him. He also did his training to become a therapist. He's a licensed mental health therapist and has been for years. And it was during his training that he started to see the writing on the wall, even though at first he was approaching his therapy training with the intention of focusing almost, exclusively on working with dreams. Like, that was his ultimate goal at first. But that changed because some of his professors started questioning and pushing back a bit at some of his ideas. So that created a little gap for him. He also was in a men's group, and they started pushing back a bit. So these are all factors that he had, to his benefit. And, when he left a full 2 years before I did. And unfortunately for me, that became a time when, the financial freedom was lessened because there was only one of us to pay for, we were only paying for one person's sessions. And he really knew, Rob, that he needed to not push me to leave because he knew that I would leave him instead. And he was absolutely right. If he had started talking to me about, this group is a cult, there's no question I would have left him at that time, because that's when I was the most asleep to myself. That's when I was most invested in the group.
To me, this really demonstrated his love for you, his loyalty, his patience.
We love each other very much. And, his patience with me, his capacity to wait for me is one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given in my life. And I am, deeply grateful to him for that. Not only for that, but also for the way that he has been able to give me the space to do my post-cult healing, which is, because I was deeper in it's been a longer and more complicated healing process.
Well, let's move on to the snapping phase. When did the cracks begin to appear in your devotion to this group?
Yeah, in retrospect, there are multiple cracks. And one of those cracks, again, this is, the hindsight view. One of those cracks actually was around my brother's death because I think there's a part of me that, knew that it was just wrong to not show up, to not be there with my sisters and my father, for my brother's funeral. And had I been there, who knows? I may well have been able to leave earlier because of the intensity of, what happened within my family after that. Another crack, I think, was I mentioned earlier that when the leadership in the organization started pushing back, they stopped doing some of their tasks, which made space for me to do some of, like, I was finally just the beginning of stepping up into a pseudo teacher role. I got to travel with them and do, kind of be the main person on one of their trips, and in an away workshop and retreat. But the way that I was treated at that workshop was very different from the way that I was told I'd be treated. So when I was being trained to be that person, I was told that, yep, you'll go out to lunch with them and you'll get to talk through things, and it's such an honor, it's so beautiful, and you'll get to do this and that. And there was none of that. I kept like waiting for their acknowledgement. And I even asked, so should we go out to lunch? And they're like, oh, no, we'll meet you after. And it was like, a knife. It's like I was the scourge, so the cognitive dissonance of that experience was absolutely a crack. But there was really the main crack. And oh, there was another crack too that we didn't mention yet, which is a beautiful friend, someone who I was particularly close to in CTL, in the group, was someone who died by suicide. And that was, I don't really want to go into that situation right now, and I write about it quite a bit in my book, but that was a profound experience. And again, the way that his struggles before he died and the way that his death was handled were also cracks. And yet, even with all of those things happening, I was still the devoted student. I was still behaving everything, my day-to-day life, I was still doing all my volunteer work. I was still showing up for the executive meetings. I was still doing, all my classes and believing everything until there was a massive fracture that took place. And that's where I really snapped out.
And this is 2014. There was, I think you described it as a mass exodus of leaders. They all left at once, like on the same day, right?
Exactly. Like I mentioned earlier, like there was this like revolving door concept, like, okay, you can leave anytime you want. Like that was part of the narrative. So the way that you left was by writing an email to this email listserv that we had. It had to be done individually, and you would say that, okay, I'm leaving CTL, and this is why, and this is my inner work right now. And most of the time, people who left, and I had left twice myself at different periods throughout those years, people would leave and say, oh, I need to focus on my inner work, and, I look forward to coming back. Like that was mostly what was said. But then on this one day, in May 2014, 6 emails came in from each of the 6 head leaders in the organization, like one after the other, after the other, after the other. And it was, just like earthquake. Like in my psyche, it was absolutely a massive earthquake. I literally could not find the ground. It was absolutely devastating. But then we were given the opportunity to have the next day, the following day, was executive committee. And Doug allowed us, quote unquote, allowed us to have one last executive committee meeting, and he didn't come to it. He didn't always come to he always came to some part of executive committee meeting. He had never missed an entire meeting, but this one, he didn't come at all. And my experience was I went into that meeting with this burning question of why did you all leave at the same time? Because each one of their emails had detailed why they had come to that personal decision, but it didn't address why they all left on the same day. And for me, that was this massive cognitive dissonance. What the fuck is going on? That after all these years of dedication to this mission, to this, this community, to this great love that we have for each other, why are you all jumping ship together? There's something you're not telling. There's something that you're not saying in these emails. And I went to that executive committee meeting with that question just burning in my heart. And the entire meeting, it was an hour and a half meeting, and what I heard was blah, 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 blah. Nobody was saying why they left altogether. And I asked it several times. And then finally, one of the teachers, who was the quietest one, and I would say she was the teacher who I had the closest heart connection with. And she just spoke in this really quiet voice and described how Doug would call her and berate her. And she used the word berate, and that he would go on and on and on, sometimes for hours, berating her. And this person had a history of child trauma. She is a poet, a deeply sensitive person. And when I heard her quietly describe the way that Doug, my esteemed teacher who I had on a pedestal, how Doug treated her, that was the crack, the big crack. That was whoa, this is abuse. And suddenly seeing how he had harmed her knocked him off that pedestal. And I was for the first time in 18 years, relating to her as an equal who was harmed by someone who we both had revered. And I left that meeting in this state of, it's kind of hard to describe. I later spoke to a friend of mine who was sitting across from me at that moment in the meeting, which is literally the last 5 minutes of the meeting is when this teacher, ex-teacher spoke. And my friend who was sitting across from me said, Gerette, I watched it happen. I watched you snap out of, the CTL cult, the CTL narrative. She wasn't using the word cult at that time, but pretty quickly we were. So I walked out of that meeting. I didn't speak to a single person from that moment. And I drove home. I had a long drive home through the wilderness, and got back to my home. And then it was by the time I got back to my home that I realized that Doug had done the same to me that he had done to her. And that the pedestal that I had put him on had kept me from what was most important to me. And that was my family and my home. And, I walked in and woke up my husband. He was sleeping, the kids were sleeping. And that was the beginning of my freedom from the grip, from the cultic grip.
What did your husband say when you came in and woke him up and told him about what had just happened? What was his reaction?
His reaction was just his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "I've been waiting for this."
Did you go back after that, or were you done on that day?
There were some small stages. First, I was very quickly, you had to write the email, like, okay, I'm done with being part of the group. That was the first step. Within, each day there was another thing. By the third day, I was like, oh, I'm done with individual sessions with Doug. And I sent him a text, let him know, and he was like, it's okay, bye. There was nothing. I also worked for him, privately. I did, believe it or not, I did bookkeeping for him. And I actually continued that for a while. And there was something quite actually empowering about that he was paying me for work that he valued me to do, and I was no longer paying him. So that went on for a few months, until his wife nixed that. I was not to be trusted anymore, and that was fine. It was time for it to be done anyway.
The end was very anticlimactic in a good way, because I was wondering how you were going to get out, if you were going to have to fight. I don't mean physically, but what was it going to be like? And it was a relief how you were able to walk away from the group. But I'm sure that there must have been some moments in the days that followed when you maybe thought about going back.
Do you know what, Rob? I never did. Not once. I, like you, have heard many, many stories, and I know that that's not that common. My experience was so profound. My snapping was really putting me back in the center of my own life. It was like I had been operating with the autonomous Gerette existing, 20 feet outside of me. And with that moment, it was like a zing back into alignment. And, it's usually a more gradual process. And for me, it was literally like I have never wanted to go back. The relationships that I lost was a heavy burden, and I had a lot of grieving to do. And there was also anger, and that is totally natural. I was very, very fortunate in that way. And part of it is that, that my husband was already out. So I was so fortunate in that way, that he just welcomed me back. And not only that, I had been for decades, for almost the entire time that I was in the group, I had been in a women's group, and they welcomed me back. They saw me fall into it. They witnessed me through all that disassociation. And they didn't know how bad it had gotten, really, because I was always protecting them from the worst of it. But they absolutely rejoiced, when I was back. They were my first people to let know.
Earlier in the book, you mentioned that you had a friend who had to go to therapy because of what she saw you going through in the group. So I'm sure that you had
Yeah,
many friends and family, I would imagine
yeah,
as well, who were relieved when you got out of this.
absolutely. And yes, and that friend was one of the women in my women's group, and she's still, one of my closest friends and neighbors. Really, and deeply, very, very close friend.
So now, waking up again and again, tell us about your recovery process because it's been about 12 years. What have you gone through to work through this?
Yeah, the waking up again and again is for me the recognition of how, even though I never wanted to go back to the group, I had multiple experiences where, where I almost fell for something else. And I was an educator, before getting so deeply involved. I was a certified special educator. And I was also had always been really interested in child development and human development, as well as the human brain. So when I snapped out, I was like, what the hell happened to me? Like, how could I have been that lost, for that long? So I started studying and reading. My friends who welcomed me back with open hearts and open minds had wonderful perspective to offer me. They also, some of them had really great resources. One dear friend handed me the work of Dr. Dan Siegel and his work. He's a well-known psychotherapist and who specializes and had focused a lot on brain development and brain health. So his work was particularly helpful for me, and I learned about, through him, the importance of creating a coherent narrative. So wherever one experiences trauma, looking at that trauma and understanding and finding the coherence and finding a narrative that makes sense is a profoundly organizing and helpful experience. So that was very important for me early on. I've always been a journaler. So I started doing a lot of writing. During the first year, I did a few different sessions. In fact, I did some sessions with some of those top teachers who were part of the group who had all left, those 6 teachers. And they were helpful, but not, definitely not what I needed. And also, that was within the narrative. It was the same thing that I had left. So I needed something outside of that whole doctrine. Even though they were working with dreams in a more ethical way, and I think they have made improvements in that, there still are a lot of the same foundational tenets. So I could only do so much work within that framework that was so familiar and really too familiar, even though they were psychologically out. So then I was very fortunate to find a really good therapist. And I have to say, I was also incredibly fortunate that my life situation was that my husband had a job that was paying enough for our family to survive. And also, we had good insurance. So I had, I had those resources that were incredibly helpful. And I could get good therapy. I searched for a therapist and found like 3 or 4. I searched for someone who knew the work of Dr. Dan Siegel, and I searched for someone who knew about spiritual abuse and was also good with trauma and grief. because those were all my issues. I was very fortunate to find someone who I worked with for 4 years, and she was incredibly helpful.
And how long was it before you started thinking about helping other people who were in these situations?
It was interesting. I've been an educator my whole life. So as I started putting together these pieces and understanding what coercion was, understanding the mechanisms of control, and starting to see that, these mechanisms exist everywhere in every level of society and in all different kinds of groups and organizations, and even in families and intimate partnerships. Just like those neurons firing, and I'm naturally, being, a mother, being a woman, I have a natural tendency to want to help people. But it was really when this was probably, oh gosh, I should probably check this, maybe 5, 6 years after I left. A woman that I met at a woman's business group was really intrigued by my story. And she, we had tea together, and she was like, Gerette, I really think you should write a book. And her work is as a book coach. And I was like, I don't know, like maybe. And, I thought about it, and took me kind of a while to wrap my brain around it, but there was also, I could tell that there was something there for me. And so the process of writing my book, and then of course, kind of the work that you do when you're a completely unknown person, as a new author, kind of building a platform and all of that. So that became, part of my life. And of course, my hope was, with the book, that it would help people. My book was published in 21, but it was a 4-year process of writing the book. And through that period, I made lots of amazing connections within the cult recovery space. I started attending the annual conferences of the International Cultic Studies Association. And it was really there that by the second year of attending, so I started attending them in 2015, and I've gone almost every year since then. By the second year, I had started presenting. So, that's my nerdy educator self. I'm nerdy, I like to help. So it was a natural kind of shift. So it started earlier, but then it was really my book that brought me into this space of really developing my work as an educator and consultant.
I know there are going to be people listening to this podcast who have family members or friends in these types of groups. So, what is your advice for someone who wants to see their loved one free from a group like this?
I love that question. There are, fortunately for people today, there are many more resources available than there were in 2014 when I left. So, kudos to the many wonderful podcasters out there like yourself, Rob. Listening to podcasts is something that is very helpful for people. Hearing other people's stories can be one of the most beautiful ways of just recognizing yourself, being able to kind of step back from your personal situation and see yourself in a different light. I also definitely recommend people reaching out to the checking out the website for the International Cultic Studies Association. There are a lot of resources, including a massive library of resources. That's probably the most comprehensive one available. There are people who have training and orientation in how to coach you to maintain a relationship. It's very important to not isolate your loved one who you're concerned about. And in fact, I also have a small podcast that's called Living Cult Free, the podcast. It was originally developed as Everyday Cults, Everyday People. And it includes an interview I did with Dr. Steve Hassan, and we talk about how to maintain a relationship with people. So that can be a helpful resource for people. I always offer a free 20-minute consultation with anybody who's concerned. And one of the things that I love to do most is actually, connect people with a variety of resources, whether it's resources that I can offer if there's an interest in, some of the few things that I offer, but also I kind of hesitate to, I don't hesitate. I actually eagerly say this, but I hate to say it, that it is important for people to be aware that unfortunately the realm of cult recovery resources, it's kind of become like a hot topic in society today. So it has attracted bad actors. Like that's kind of unfortunately just what happens in any universe. So there are self-serving actors out there. So more than anything, I really encourage people to trust their gut and double check, their resources, try to get some validation from other places, and keep looking. If something doesn't feel right, to keep looking. It's very, it's a complex world out there, but ultimately there are very, very good resources available today. Thank goodness.
And how can our listeners connect with your work?
The best thing is to go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter. I have a weekly newsletter that I send out, and I really write about, what's up in my own life and how I'm seeing and interacting and dealing with cultic dynamics that are, happening in the world today. And of course, that's very much the case, unfortunately, in the United States in particular, but really globally. We have controlling and cultic dynamics that are getting a lot of airtime. And so in my newsletter, I am always looking at various aspects of the mechanisms of control, how they're playing out in my personal world and also in the world, on the world stage. My newsletter is one way, but also the primary work that I do centers on supporting people to use writing as a tool for integration and healing. And that can be, some people are interested in writing a book, but most people are, more interested in just using writing as that, as Dr. Dan Siegel talks about, that creating a coherent narrative. And it's just so powerfully organizing and orienting, because no matter, to me, what's the most important thing is that we, as survivors, and even as family members who have people who are worried about people we love in controlling or cultic groups or relationships, we're all experiencing various levels of grief and anger and cognitive dissonance. And one of the extraordinary things I've learned in my post-cult recovery is that those three things, accessing our grief, our anger, and identifying the cognitive dissonance that we experience, are actually our best friends. And we can bring all three of those and every other emotion under the rainbow into our writing and into our conversations with each other. And it can be so orienting and so helpful. So that's the gist of the work that I do. I offer symposiums, a writing symposium, twice a year. And that's a really kind of accessible thing. I have different speakers and authors come offering their perspective on how writing can be a tool for well-being and for reclaiming the autonomy that was hijacked in the cultic group. And then I also offer a variety of small group classes and also one-on-one coaching and trauma and cult-informed manuscript reviews and all that kind of stuff. But all of that's on my website, which is GeretteBuglion.com.
Gerette, I want to thank you so much for joining us on How We Escaped. Thank you.
It's my greatest honor, Rob. I'm so delighted. And I want to really applaud you and thank you for your insightful questions. I wish you all the best with this podcast. I have a very good feeling for it.
Thank you, Gerette. You can visit Gerette's website at GeretteBuglion.com. Please go and get her book on Amazon. It's called An Everyday Cult. Wherever you are listening, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. Our next story is dropping soon, and you will not want to miss it. The author Ian McLaren once wrote, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a harder battle." Until we meet again, I'm Rob Drake. Yellabai.
Have a story to share with us? Visit howweescape.com to get in touch.
How we escaped.